We're hosting today the chair of the WorldFish board, Professor Yusuf Abubakar, and our vice chair, Alyssa Jade. Great pleasure to have them here in Penang, and wonderful to see our staff here from the Penang office, also in the auditorium. And I know that many of us have joined from our different offices online. So welcome everybody for what is, I hope, a celebration of and a snapshot of our science this year. This has been a good year for us in terms of our science outputs, lots of achievements to celebrate and impactful work going on all over the organization. Even in what has been in many ways quite a difficult year, people have done really good work, and it's to celebrate some of that good work that we gather today. And we have 4 speakers, and my colleague John Benzie is going to introduce our 4 speakers. So thank you all for coming and for listening. If you have questions, don't hesitate to come forward with those questions at the end of the talks. We want to try and engage our scientists in a debate and to get them to explain to you what it is that they're doing and why they're excited about it. So if there's something more you want to know, or something that you're excited about, or you have some kind of reaction, then please do share it. Don't be shy in asking questions. Okay, thank you, John.
So our first speaker today is going to be Dr. Hampus Eriksson from the Solomon Islands and Australia. Hampus is a senior scientist in the Sustainable Aquatic Food Systems and is based in Wollongong, where he's also an associate professor at the University of Wollongong. And he's also the acting country leader for the Solomon Islands. So some ground rules. The talks are intended to be 10 minutes, ladies and gentlemen, and I will be keeping watch. And the aim for the audience here to understand is that they won't be specifically lectures on a topic. They'll also be talking about the scientists themselves, what got them interested and excited in these topics. And so I'm now going to pass you to Hampus. Please go ahead, Hampus.
Thank you, John. Just checking if you can see my presentation, if you can hear me okay?
Yes. Okay,
thank you. Yeah, thank you for that introduction, John. That's much appreciated. I am going to talk today a little bit about an opportunity for innovation in research programming, which is been a bit of a personal endeavor during the year to pursue, and is growing, I think. But in order to get there, I'm going to take you on a bit of a journey. And man, does this painting tell a story. It's such a good scene, and I'm going to put it up on the full screen for you. This painting is about the historical origins of island societies and their food security. In Solomon Islands, we quite often work with local artists, and this particular one, his name is John Limai Toh, and he is from the northern parts of Malaita, from an area called Lau. And he has helped us many times to paint images of island life, of traditions, protected species, and community-based resource management. In this particular scene, women are coming ashore from the artificial islands built in Langa Langa Lagoon many generations ago. The people that took up residence on these islands were landless people. They called the Wanasi, or the saltwater people, and their life and worldviews revolve around the sea. In the painting, other women and an old man are coming down from the bush with roots and building materials. They are the Wanatolo, the bush people. Historically, the Wanas and the Wanatolo, they bartered with products from the sea with products from the land. I know that this seems like a traditional practice from ancient history, but this type of exchange is still foundational for food and nutrition security in Solomon Islands. The trade and exchange with roots and fish remains the heartbeat of the Melanesian food system. This picture is from Takwa Market in rural Malaita, and it's a pretty amazing place. And I'm going to make a couple of observations on this picture. Marketing is still done on the ground. The market is very basic in that regard, and it still fills a crucially important role in people's daily lives for getting access to food, for coming together to talking and for sharing stories. The same clearing in the bush is the same place where ancestors have marketed, and it still fills that central role in people's lives today. Western views of markets just don't fit these places. They're not a market in that regard. It's something else. It's like a church. It's a gathering point. Markets here and the practice of marketing is a happy and quiet affair, not like the bustling markets in Middle East or in Asia. No one's haggling. A pile of cassava or a pile of yam or a pile of panna are $30. That's it. Markets have been places of peace during historical conflicts. And as you can see on the picture, they're also the domain of women. Much has remained same here through generations at Taqwa. Although these days cash is important in the marketing of foods and people use very colorful umbrellas to lighten up their moods and keep them sheltered from the sun. Scarcity and complementarity have been crucial features for these systems to come together. For exchange and trade to make sense, different peoples have to produce different things. Rabbit fish from Laos, pineapples from Bina, marlin from Kwayo, shell money from Langa Langa, dolphin teeth from Walanda, and so on. This type of human geography is a really salient feature of traditional island food systems. These are not value chains, and to reduce this fascinating complexity in practice with its historical origins into simplified food system concepts seems like swearing in church to me. Besides, it wouldn't tell the real story of how food is actually widely produced and distributed at the islands. Through Christianization and colonization, this image has remained pretty similar, inferring that it is actually a good way to ensure food security. So while we're inundated with Twitter posts about calls to transform food systems, we must also acknowledge that there are traditional practices with indigenous foods that work for people and for planet. And of course, there's aquatic foods, and man is their aquatic foods. These are not small island developing states, they are large ocean states, and aquatic foods are not supplementing meals, they're a staple. These places are rich in culture, tradition, and have ocean-centered worldviews, and have some of the highest frequency and rate and volume of aquatic food consumption. This is a map over the Pacific Islands, and the bubbles in yellow represent Micronesia, the sub-region of Micronesia. The blue ones are Melanesia and the green ones are Polynesia. These are the three sub-regions of the Pacific region. And the numbers and the size of the bubbles correspond to the per capita seafood consumption. This is calculated from edible portions, converted edible portions in the Household Income and Expenditure Survey. There is diversity here, as you can see. Some countries eat more than others. And there's also diversity hidden within national averages, in that some people that live closer to the sea are more likely to consume high volumes of fish than those that live up in the bush. But the message is pretty clear. People here eat a lot of fish. In Solomon Islands, where we have a country program, the per capita seafood consumption is 73 kilograms, edible portion. That's a lot of fish. But there are problems. While there's a strong base of traditional agriculture and indigenous foods and high rates of aquatic food consumption, island food systems are in transition. And this picture sort of captures that, with the importation of unhealthy, sugary, fatty, and salty foods. All top 10 countries for incidence of overweight and obesity in the world are Pacific Island countries. Just let that one sink in for a moment. All top 10 countries for incidence of overweight and obesity are Pacific Island countries. Diet-related non-communicable disease is the leading cause of death. For us, this means that we can't take our messages from Africa and Asia unfiltered into the islands, because people here eat enormous amounts of aquatic foods, but they still experience severe diet-related dysfunction with foreshortened lives. Similarly, the islands of the Pacific has a really important story to share with the rest of the world, which is, of course, that we have to look at food systems, and it's not just about fish, it's everything that goes within it. So, islands. Complex, fascinating, and a uniqueness that requires us to do place-based approaches and implement research attuned to these local contexts. Global frameworks really struggle to make sense here and capture the complexity and traditions of indigenous peoples and practices. Clearly, there are nutrition and development challenges at islands, and not always do they share the same challenges. For example, in Timor-Leste, where we have our other island program at WorldFish, the per capita aquatic food consumption is estimated at 6 kilograms per person a year. That's less than 10% of that in Solomon Islands. So clearly the nutrition challenge is different. So in order for us to sharpen our research, compare between the islands, generalize our findings and share learning, we need a logic or a framework or something to guide a programmatic approach to research with island food systems. Through history of scientific discovery, islands have provided crucial places of learning for humanity. They are the cradle of evolutionary thinking. There's even a field on island ecology. And here's an opportunity for us, island food systems. This is not just driven by the need for a program that is attuned to the unique features and challenges of islands. There's actually real opportunity for impact. We know that societies and islands can be active change makers, irrespective of their size in population or economy. Their contributions to the global climate change agenda is evidence of that. Small populations and economies, but big voices. Supporting their voice is an opportunity to help shape a sustainable agenda that works for the islands and for the rest of the world. This is my final slide. A movement is underway at the islands that seeks to rebalance equity and legacies of colonial pasts, which has negatively influenced present-day island food systems. In that movement are aspects of food sovereignty with countervailing efforts to the food system transition. One focus is on celebrating traditional practices and indigenous foods, which we know were the key elements of island resilience during COVID and all the value chain disruptions that were experienced. As part of these decolonizing efforts, there's also a strong focus on research legitimacy and equity in power over research priorities. The Pacifica Scholarship is really leading the way on the international arena here. In this aspect, a deliberate framing of research at island food systems prevents an opportunity not just about the research that we do, but how we do it and how it can be done legitimately. In that space, WorldFish is really uniquely positioned as the only CG center with a long-term permanent presence in the Pacific. Our program in Solomon Islands has taken a really deliberate approach for how to be a legitimate, present and respectful research partner. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hampus, and very smartly on time.
I tried. Thank you.
So we won't be asking questions immediately after each talk. So all of you, if you have some questions, write them down now. Be ready to ask when the last speaker finishes their talk. So I'm now going to move on to our next speaker, Dr. Marlene Schutter. She's a postdoctoral fellow in sustainable aquatic food systems. She's also the WorldFish focal point for the Initiative on National Policies and Strategies. So Marlene, over to you.
Thanks very much, John. Can you see my screen okay? Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you for the opportunity today to present some of my work, give a brief talk about what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. So I'm a postdoc at WorldFish, and I have a focus on the blue economy and the role of fisheries and aquaculture in various configurations of the blue economy. And today I would like to talk about what drives me in my research, which is creating accountability for investments in the blue economy by following through on these investments to see who ultimately benefits from them. And this is what I believe is needed to do that. Sorry, I'll just go to the next. So one key aspect that is brought up a lot about the blue economy is the importance of blue finance. And paired with the concept of blue finance are so-called innovative finance mechanisms, such as blue bonds, for example. And the idea is that in order to make investments in the blue economy, or in the blue space, rather, be it oceans, rivers, lakes, or any other wet environment, to make these investments more appealing, new financial products must become available to investors. And this has led to a flurry of initiatives aiming to promote blue finance. But I believe that two questions that remain is one, to what extent do these investments deliver on their promises? And two, who ultimately benefits from them? And I think I am sort of well placed to ask or answer these questions. I have been described as a recovering economist, and it's true that I was initially trained as one. And following my undergrad, I went into environmental economics, and that follows a line of thinking that I find very prevalent within all these crossovers between economics and natural resources. And this line of thinking goes that that we have a well-developed financial infrastructure, one that is arguably working very well for its purpose, which is generating return on capital that seeks further accumulation. But we also have issues with a diminishing natural resource base, and that leads to threats to the capability to actually accumulate wealth. So the line of reasoning goes that these threats are insufficiently recognized in financial markets, but they would be if they would just be adequately priced. And this is where my work came in. It's just a matter of pricing natural capital resources accordingly, and then it would be easy to employ economic logic on, for instance, mangrove ecosystems. And that's precisely what I did in a very apt location for sort of the financial world as well, Cayman Islands. And I was immediately given a large pickup truck. If you look carefully, you can see me, tiny me, in the big truck as well. And I used it to drive around the island, to talk to people about coral reef and mangrove ecosystems of the island, and also to talk to people about how much those were worth to them. The issue was that this type of measuring worth is just not always aligned with the realities of those who are working on the ground in those ecosystems that they rely on for their livelihoods. And that really led to difficulties for me in applying and also in explaining the methodology. People would put in so-called protest votes, where they would put unrealistically high amounts that they would supposedly be willing to pay for their ecosystems, or the opposite, where they would say it's worth $0 to me. They're just unable to put a price on the importance of their natural environments, and that really made me wonder if that was really the best way to show the importance of ecosystems. And it also made me wonder who actually benefits from economically valuing those ecosystems. And that's why now I'm applying a lot more scrutiny to plans that seemingly only have win-win-win outcomes. And these win-win-win situations are described as places where the economy, the environment, and society all win. And my next area of research was the blue economy in Seychelles, where I found a lot of dissent actually with those optimistic narratives around it. And despite Seychelles being quite the poster child for the blue economy, with innovative finance products like a debt for ocean conservation swap and also blue bonds, fishers actually failed to see any benefits accruing to them. So instead of piling on more financial products that only benefit investors by giving them a nice return, and instead of just promoting more innovative finance into the fisheries and aquaculture sector, we need to address also the underlying drivers that put pressure on the systems that we work in. As some of my colleagues have argued as well, rather than just needing more investment, there's also a need to recognize that current patterns of trade, debt, and harmful subsidies are actually harming the development of equitable blue economies as well. And these underlying drivers should be addressed, in addition to sourcing more funding. But the excitement for innovative finance tends to cast a shadow over these more fundamental and arguably less sexy issues. As a first step towards truly assessing the contribution of blue finance for fisheries and aquaculture, my current analysis looks at the levels of investment currently available under the blue economy banner. And this is a vital first step, in my view, because it maps the actual action that accompanies the blue economy discourse. There's been a lot of words, and this is trying to map the action that goes with it. The analysis is still in progress, but initial findings show an overrepresentation of investment in Europe and also in the offshore wind energy sector. And also, maybe very importantly, is that the private sector involvement has been very low. It's precisely those investors, the private sector, that have been targeted by favorable conditions for investment. And examples of those favorable conditions are, for example, the use of blended finance, which means that a large part of the risk of the investment is carried by other parties than the private investors, and those other parties are usually the state. and that really de-risks the investment for private investors and makes it a quite appealing investment, but still numbers are quite low. And there's low levels of investment. A colleague of mine, Jens Christiansen, has termed that so the private sector involvement as being in a perpetual state of proof of concept, without really making a real difference in closing finance gaps between what's needed, for instance, to reach SDGs and what's actually being brought to the table. And in these situations, the only beneficiaries really from investment is that small group of private investors who receive good returns, which is helped by tax breaks and other incentives for putting their money into blue projects. But the question remains, who ultimately benefits from them beyond those that get a financial return? To close off, I would like to say, it's true that the financial world plays an important role in our lives, but we also need to hold accountable those that are promoting investment opportunities under the banner of improving fisheries and aquaculture, and also follow through on projects and investments to see who ultimately benefits from them. Yes, we need finance, but finance needs us too. It needs investment opportunities, and it's good to stay critical of the ultimate beneficiaries of any investment, as capital will always prioritize its financial return. So we should make sure that blue finance does not only deliver on its promise of a good return to the investor, but also on the promise of improving outcomes for people in the fisheries and aquaculture sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marlene. So again, keeping to time very well. And so for all of you, just remember to get your questions recorded somehow. And for those coming in online, just to indicate that when we come to questions, I'll be asking you just to indicate by raising your hand and to then verbally ask your questions. I think we've got enough people where we can do that effectively. We don't have such a large number that may be difficult. So our next speaker is Dr. Rumana Hussain, a postdoctoral fellow in sustainable aquatic food systems. Rumana is based in Bangladesh, and she should be joining us now. And Rumana, if I can ask you to give the talk about what excites you.
Thank you, John. So I would like to start with one of my field experiences during 2019, immediately after my joining at WorldFish. Most often we find news headlines on fish loss due to climate variabilities and extremes. But when I went to field, I witnessed the loss of not only fish, but also fingerlings and hatchery operations in the southwestern part of Bangladesh. It was June 2019, and the temperature was varying from 36 to 40 degrees centigrade, having no rain for about 3 consecutive weeks. One of the hatchery operators at a certain point of our discussion was saying, if I could have the information before the farming season, I could change my decision on the fingerling production period to avoid this loss. And one of the fish farmers was saying, if I knew that there will be no rain in June and the temperature will be so high, I could decide stocking period a bit early or a bit late to avoid this climatic stress. So this actually made me to think further, to study more, and to explore how we can develop climate information services for aquaculture to manage such climate risks and reduce the associated losses. So I'll be sharing with you the journey of developing climate information services for aquaculture in Bangladesh, and how a simple but timely information and a very simple but actionable advisory services can manage risks and reduce the loss. So after coming back from the field, I started reviewing literatures, and you'll be surprised to know that I did not find a single literature on climate information services for aquaculture. And then I realized that first we need to have a dialogue with all relevant stakeholders, like Bangladesh Meteorological Department, who is the source of reliable climate information to provide, and Department of Fisheries, Fisheries Research Institute, who can translate that information in the form of advisory services for aquaculture, and also private sectors like mobile phone operators and agribusiness companies who can advise on the best communication mechanisms, and also the end users, I mean the fish farmers, hatchery and nursery operators, and also market actors, who ultimately will be using the information and services. So after several back and forth discussion with our partners and all relevant stakeholders, we were able to conduct a 5-day long training dialogue, which was hosted at Bangladesh Meteorological Department at their campus. And the output of the dialogue at the end of the week was simply amazing. We all together developed 2 decision frameworks. One is based on temperature thresholds and the other one is on rainfall thresholds. We developed it primarily for 4 fish species, considering the range of cultivation and economic importance. When the forecasted information will exceed the identified thresholds of a particular fish species, then the decision framework will trigger the climate-sensitive operations along with advisory services. And what next? Then we incorporated this decision framework in an existing decision support system, that is Advisely, and which was initially developed for providing climate information services for a number of agri-crops. So Advisely hosted this decision framework. We utilized the scope to add a crop in that system to make it more comprehensive. So this system is generating climate services with a 5-day lead time and able to trigger advisories to manage day-to-day climate risks. For instance, lime application to balance pH level during high temperatures, aeration to enhance the dissolved oxygen level, protecting the ponds using nets during heavy rain, or irrigating ponds during dry spell, and most importantly, the feeding ratio management at different temperature scenario. Now, I would like to share a feedback from one of our participants from the training dialogue, Mr. Mizan from Khulna, sent an email after a climatic event across the southern coastal region of Bangladesh. And I'm quoting from his email. You know that 10th November, the devastating cyclone Bulbul hit at Khulna, Bagherhat and Shatkhira district. We and some of our beneficiaries got the forecast from BMD calling over 1090. It was so helpful for all of us that we took early preparation to save our resources. And what does this mean to me? To me, this feedback from Mr. Mizan reveals the need of aquatic food producers' skill to respond to climate risks using climate information services, which should be completed with enhancing their capacity. We are also scaling this knowledge to the northwestern drought-prone region of the country, because we started with the southwestern region. Now we are scaling this knowledge to the northwest through our BMGF-funded IDEA Projects digital platform, and also facilitating institutional arrangements to ensure fish farmers access to input materials, financial services, and products. We also disseminated climate information services in the state of Odisha, India, through Reliance Foundation Information Service Platform during adverse services in context of that region. And I have very recently visited, and my observation is that seasonal climate information services would be more beneficial than the weekly or daily climate services, as the dry season and onset of monsoon are 2 major hydroclimatic factors for aquaculture in that region. So from all my experiences in Bangladesh, India, and Zambia, one of the major barriers to advanced climate information services and make the developed digital system sustainable is the absence of IoT, or we can say the automated data input system using submersible sensors in water for measuring the parameters to provide the services on harvest prediction, feeding optimization, water quality management, and for some cases also remote monitoring. We do not need to install it in each and every pond. Rather, installing in a few ponds based on climatic subregions can support to run the digital system sustainably. So I would like to conclude by flagging urgency of financial inclusion for climate risk management using climate services, because small-scale farmers are especially in need of such services, as they are the most climate vulnerable group. And our studies showed that only 1% increase in aquaculture productivity by managing climate risks could provide 24,000 tons of fish to feed 1 million people with protein. And aquaculture climate services might have an annual economic value of up to $14 million if 10% of the damage can be offset. So these findings recognize a wide range of impact pathway of climate information services, from food and nutrition to socioeconomic to climate and environment. Therefore, climate risk management using climate services is critical to shift from vulnerability through building resilience towards prosperity. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Romana. Again, excellent timekeeping. And so we'll come to our last speaker now, who is actually present in the room. And it's Dr. Ben Belton. And I have to say here, we were using these talks to highlight the work by our younger scientists. And as we've gone through the talks, they are aging a little bit. So Ben is our last one. And he's a senior scientist in sustainable aquatic food systems. Ben is also the co-leader of Asian Megadeltas Initiative, and he's an associate professor at the University of Michigan State in the USA. So Ben, over to you.
Thank you, John. So yes, as you said, my name is Ben Belton. I'm also the interim global lead for social and economic inclusion here at WorldFish, and presenting today about cracking the code of monoseed mass production to scale up nutrition sensitive aquaculture. So you might be wondering, why is a social scientist presenting on this topic that seems quite technical? So to answer this, and in the style of a TED talk, I have to go back right to the beginning of my career in Thailand in 2005, where I first went to start to research processes of aquaculture development. And as I was staying in Thailand, interviewing farmers, interviewing other people in value chains, I actually lived at a tilapia hatchery, and I also participated in the everyday workings of the hatchery, including draining a fish pond here and catching the fish in the mud at the bottom. And so later during my PhD, I began also to study how hatchery technology had diffused among different hatchery owners through social networks, through the social capital that they had. And so I took away this sort of understanding of the fundamental importance of seed produced in hatcheries as the cornerstone of the development of aquaculture, and also the importance of the development of hatchery sectors. I then moved to Bangladesh in 2008, later during the PhD, and so Bangladesh has a huge inland capture fishery in rivers, natural water bodies, and also in rice fields. As you can see here, this is a rainy day in northern Bangladesh, and almost all of the men in the village were out in the rice fields harvesting small fish that were migrating through the rice fields to spawn. And you can see here in close-up, there's this huge diversity of these small fishes, very beautiful, but as I later found out, also very highly nutritious. But over time, the productivity of these capture fisheries is gradually declining through the intensification of agriculture, through habitat conversion, through overexploitation in some cases. And at the same time that process was playing out, aquaculture was also rising, growing very rapidly, as you can see from this landscape of ponds in southern Bangladesh. And so the implications of this is sort of illustrated in this graph. This is data on retail prices for common fish species from markets all over Bangladesh over about a 3.5 year period. The solid lines are for common farm species like tilapia, pangasius, silver carp. And you can see that over this period of time, the prices are basically static. And so if you factor in inflation, maybe actually they're getting cheaper over time. Whereas the dotted lines are for mola and puti, two small indigenous fish, similar to what you saw in the picture. And the prices are steadily rising over time as they become scarcer. So these small nutritious fish becoming less accessible over time. So in about 2010, when I joined WorldFish in Bangladesh, Shakuntala Tilsted, now the World Food Prize laureate for her work on nutrition-sensitive aquaculture that inspires this presentation, also came to Bangladesh. And so we began working closely together. And I learned from her about the importance of these small fish in terms of their nutrient composition. And so based on Shakuntala's insights, WorldFish began to promote the polyculture of these small indigenous fish alongside conventional carp aquaculture. And so this idea of nutrition-sensitive polyculture became sort of an important idea that was picked up by projects funded by IFAD, by USAID, by Gates, and so on. And so basically these projects tend to revolve around training households on nutrition, but also training them on improving aquaculture practices, and including stocking these small fish in conventional carp systems. And so as you can see illustrated here, the fish are stocked in the pond, they breed in the pond, they're harvested, processed, consumed by the household, contributing to household nutrition. But the problem, as I saw it at this time, was that this system was dependent on having a project in place to go out, harvest the seed from wild sources, bring it to a village, put it in a pond, distribute it from the pond to the households in that village. And so based on what I understood about the importance of seed and the importance of hatcheries, I understood then that in order to really scale up this technology, the crucial technical bottleneck was to be able to mass produce the seed of these small indigenous fish species. And so that was always sort of something that I wanted to do. And the opportunity arose in 2020 when I returned to WorldFish. And the first thing that I really worked on was developing a project proposal for GIZ. And so aiming explicitly to overcome this technical bottleneck. So we selected 2 partner hatcheries in India, one in Assam and one in Odisha. They're both private sector hatcheries. That was also important based on my understanding of how the hatchery sector developed. And we worked with those hatcheries to upgrade their facilities and get them to a state where we could start beginning breeding trials. And you can see some of the infrastructure developed here. Unfortunately, similar to what Romana has just described, in Assam, our hatchery was completely wiped out by a huge flood. And so this is the village where the hatchery was. We lost all of our brood stock. The hatchery was completely flooded. So we had to concentrate efforts intensively in Odisha. And the field team essentially decamped to the hatchery for 3 or 4 months and worked day and night to develop the technology for spawning mola, which is one of the sort of most famous and the most nutrient rich of these small fish species. So developed a replicable system for mass producing mola using hormone injection, and eggs hatch out into hatchlings, as you can see here. You can see that the stages of larval development at the bottom, and actually quite quickly we were able to produce millions of these mola hatchlings. You can see them being measured out in a cup here, put in a bag, ready for distribution to farms. We also developed a system for nursing them on farm. So you can see here a farmer who's just purchased a bag full of these mola fry, about 1 inch long. And so over the space of one breeding season, we produced more than 6 million mola hatchlings, many tens of thousands of mola fry, and sold to quite a large number of farmers within Odisha. We've also held this seed release event with the government of Odisha, with the Department of Fisheries, distributing the fish seed to women's self-help groups who'd previously worked with WorldFish. And so we now have these farmers stocking their ponds and also even already beginning to harvest the mola. This is actually from a pond at the partner hatchery where we stocked some of the surplus seed. And so now we're getting to the part where we have a really workable system. We're starting to disseminate the knowledge. This is just from the last 2 weeks. 2 of the key members of the project in Singapore at a conference, presenting their work, and here in Penang writing up the paper. And that basically serves as a protocol for anyone else who wishes to replicate this system. So we believe that this is a really critical technology for scaling up nutrition sensitive aquaculture, with the potential really to reach millions of people. And also potential to diversify into other species. We're also in the coming year going to be working on several other species. And so this is really all thanks to the dedication and the extremely hard work and application of this field team, who I'd like to acknowledge here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. If you could stay on the stage, please, because we're now going to ask Eddie if he could also move on to the stage. I'll follow you up so that we'll now have a question and answer session for all 4 of the talks. And I think what we made, you want to, yes, if you got, yes, please. Yeah, I'll head up. So firstly, any questions from the audience?
Thank you so much. Fantastic presentations. I have questions for everybody that relate very much to the questions we have here at WorldFish, but also at the CG. May I just read out 4 questions for 4 different people and they can collect questions over time? Is that how we do it here?
That's fine. Yes.
Excellent. Thank you. Hampus, fantastic work on decolonializing the food system as it relates to island practices. How do you address the emerging role of China in the region regarding investment, debt, and also trade in this approach? A question for Marlene. Regarding accountability investments, at the CG, we're currently looking at how we, let's say, monetize our data that we sit on. We collect huge amounts of data about all sorts of food, livestock, aquatic foods around the world. And on one side, we have capital demand, such as national agricultural institutes and things like that. And on the other side, we have capital suppliers in terms of investors. Should, in your opinion, the CG take a role to be an honest broker of data that we know and can predict environmental situations and productivity? Should we be the ones that monetize our data to connect capital demand, as in NARS, and capital supply, in her opinion? The question for Romana is, the G7 in Japan in May are currently looking at science and digitalization, and the example with the IoT in ponds and the triggering daily news is a fantastic solution. A question that the G7 has asked us at CG is how to scale overcoming of the digital divide with solutions like this, because the solution that is presented is fantastic, but it's predicated on farmers having phones, data plans, and digital literacy. If the G7 were to put money down and say that they would like to enable mass scaling of an approach that Romana had suggested, how would we overcome that digital divide at the same time?
Okay, so I think perhaps if we can start with the first question that you asked, which was of Hampus. Hampus, are you able to respond? Yeah. I can't see you from where I am.
I have my camera on, but and I'll have a crack at it. It's not an easy question to answer. I mean, I can give some generic responses to that I think are appropriate, but I can see the challenge in it. But in some ways, it's, you know, addressing the emerging role of China is like addressing the emerging role of many other actors and complex economic systems and structures that wax and wane through time. And I think that as a headline, it has to be engaged with positively and constructively. It is a highly political issue at the moment in the Pacific Islands, but I know that it's also like that in other parts of the world as well. I think as a broad observation, islands, because of the small economies, small populations, and relative isolation, tend to have a limited economic leverage, which influences their ability to negotiate trade arrangements and their food policies, which is partially one of the reasons why we see such an enormous influx of imported foods. During the 1980s and 90s, the agricultural production in the Pacific Islands halved at a time when the net food import doubled. And that pattern has not been recovered, which means that the domestic food production is at a much lower level or rate by volume than is the potential. And at the same time, that food has been imported food. And so with that, preferences have changed and other things have changed. And we know through trade statistics in the Pacific that the majority of that shift has also shifted away from products in Australia and New Zealand to products from Asia, Philippines, Taiwan, China. So I know that these are bigger patterns that are occurring. I don't have all the answers here, but I think it's a really important feature to consider into the future. If I was to make one final remark, is also to say that in this area, there's a lot of debate about what can be called environmental looting and lootable resources. And that's not just in the islands, that's also happening in other parts of the world. And environmental looting as a feature or lootable resources exist in the literature on political ecology and how looting often fuels civil unrest and civil war. So there is a connection between unrest and natural resources. And in the context of Solomon Islands, a really big looting feature that's been occurring for the past decades is in the logging industry. And logging is partially related to China, but it's also Malaysia. It's also a suite of multinational corporations and actors. And so if we're serious about talking about preserving environments, maintaining peace, and these things, then it's not just China. It's a bigger conversation we need to be having about how international economic structures and multinational corporations engage with small economies in a positive way. I think that's my intuitive response. It's a difficult question, but that's all I can sort of muster up in these 30 seconds I was given to prepare. I hope that works.
Thank you. So, Marlene, do you have a response to the question about effectively monetization of data, if I remember correctly? Marlene?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Yeah. Thank you for the question. I think it's a great question and again, difficult to answer, but I think it's very good to be, conscious of the wider developments in which that kind of monetization would happen. I like the term acting as an honest broker, and I do think CGIAR is well placed to potentially fulfill that role, building on existing partnerships and relationships and equitable sharing the benefits with communities that we work in. And I also agree that it would have to be a very conscious process of first start to think about it, then sort of devising the mechanisms through which that monetization would occur, and at the same time also keep working in these partnerships to make sure that the benefits from monetization are actually sort of equitably distributed. And I also see how doing nothing is probably also not a good idea, because others will move into that space as well. So having a sort of a considerate approach to it, I think is a very good first step. And also maybe recognizing that doesn't always have to lead into direct monetization, but at least engaging with that process or seeing sort of the demands for that kind of data will be important, also to map different interest groups and those who might be interested in actually getting their hands on those data. Thank you.
And Romana, I think if you can respond to the question on scaling your activities.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that question. And for scaling and also to overcome digital divide, if we have enough investment in science and digitalization, so I would like to mention here two different issues. First of all, different levels of end users to have the information or to receive the digital types of things. First of all, if we look at the small scale farmers, for sure they do not have that access to digital platforms, or they do not have the smartphones for which they cannot go directly to that digital platform to have those information and services. To address that, I think that we need to build the capacity. Institutional capacity building is important, because the small-scale fish farmers, they depend on the local extension workers or the local extension officers from government departments. They depend on them to have the information and services. So if we can if you can build the capacity of at the institutional level, I think we can reduce this gap. And for the commercial farmers, I would say they always seek for this type of solution. I mean, what I have presented, this solution actually was very well received by our commercial farmers here in Bangladesh context, I would say. But for the small scale fish farmers to reduce that or to overcome the digital divide, I think institutional capacity building would be good. And yeah, that's my quick response, that we have two different types of users for this type of digital platforms. One is we can go directly to them who are working as a commercial, using it as a commercial purpose. But for the small scale users, we need to build the capacity of the relevant institutions, so that they can have the access of that information and services easily from them. Thank you.
Thank you, Romana. Any other questions from the audience here? Well, I was going to just move to online soon, but the trouble is I can't actually see who's raised their hands. So can we, if Rainer, if you can check that, then how many hands do we have raised from online? Okay, Arun, if you can ask your question, please, while we're sorting out the other ones.
Not a question, rather. Can you hear me, John?
I can hear you very well, thank you.
Okay, this is not a question, but just an add-on thing for the question on digital divide and for scaling. For example, in India, we have already existing platforms, communication platforms developed by government, which is reaching very remote areas across the country to various farmers. I mean, with different commodities, including and also to fishermen. So it would be very beneficial if we just integrate our whatever the science information with the existing platforms, so that it is listened by so many people with very with minimum cost for us. So this is a good thing what we have done in Odisha, especially it is a state. Same thing can be done across India in various states, because agriculture and fisheries is a state subject in India, and state governments are investing on this. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment, Aaron. Is there anyone else, Rainer, that... Okay, David, can you ask your question, please?
Can you hear me?
Hear you very well, thank you.
Okay, yeah, really fantastic presentations. Just for Romana, we are sort of moving in a similar direction in Timor-Leste with climate information systems for both capture fisheries and aquaculture. I'm just wondering, did you identify any useful off-the-shelf type solutions around the IoT approaches in ponds, or do you have to assemble your own hardware around that? Yeah.
Yes, at this moment, the data input system we set up here in Bangladesh is really manual. We provided the fish farmers a very simple water temperature recording thermometer. They are recording the temperatures and providing it as an input to the system. Because what the problem here is that we are having the climate information or forecast information from meteorological department, but that is air temperature, So to provide climate information services for aquaculture, we need to convert the air temperature into the water temperature so that they can manage the water quality like pH, dissolved oxygen, all these things. So the main issue here is that with the data input system at this moment is very manual. If we cannot make it an automated system, then the sustainability of the system is questionable, you know. So yeah.
Are there any efforts in that direction? Are you working with technology companies on that at all?
No, we are yet to try to have those type of things, because in Bangladesh we had a discussion with Department of Fisheries, but we actually yet to manage that how to install that automated data system in ponds.
Okay, perhaps we need to work together on that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Excellent. Rainer, are we through with hands? Okay, so Essam has a question.
Thank you very much. I think all inspiring talks, honestly, that we really exceeded, I'm sure exceeded everyone's expectations. So a huge congratulations, Ben, Marlene, Hampus, Romana. Excellent presentation on all topics. I think I have one question, but maybe sort of broadly, not necessarily provocative, but since, you know, I think it came across very, you know, it came across with passion in terms of the work that you're doing, which is fantastic. And I think that's what brings us together here. I guess my question is, what would happen in this world if we were to stop doing what you're doing now? I mean, modesty aside, just how, in other words, you know, why is it so useful for this world's future? Is one broader question for everyone who's got, you know, don't necessarily feel obliged to answer that, but if you want to answer, please go ahead. One specific question for Marlene. Marlene, again, thank you very much for that inspiring talk. One thing I've been very keen to understand, but haven't been able to find any data on, is it's really great that you've done this mapping of financial flows, you know, in the blue economy. Do we have data that makes distinction between small scale and large scale? For instance, I saw some figures in Africa, for instance, which is quite a substantial amount of financial flows in Africa. But my immediate reaction was, really, where exactly is this? You know, so do we have a disaggregated data in terms of, you know, whether, I mean, going to an oil and gas sector, for instance, counts as a financial flow into blue economy, or do we make any distinction between large scale and small scale? For instance, is really financial flows into aquatic food systems in the region, for instance? Marlene, thank you.
Over to you, Marlene.
Thank you. Thanks, Essam, also for the provoking question, to which I don't really have a direct answer, but it's good to keep maybe thinking about that question as we go about our work, sort of the so what of our work, I suppose. As to your question about disaggregating sort of the types of projects that are funded under that are using the blue economy label, we don't know, and I think it's very important to zoom in more to also look at even at this sort of scale, to look at beyond what shows up on financial statements and to really look at impact on the ground. Who is it actually? Is it actually also delivering on its promises? Because the level of analysis currently is only looking at disbursements. It's not yet following through on projects, because of quite a few of these financial flows are also quite recent, with a more recent emergence of interest in the blue economy. But I think that's maybe also part of an answer to your first question. I think that remains really important to do for us to employ that scrutiny, so that it doesn't just stay at the sort of the narrative or the discourse level, so that we can zoom in on these investments, particularly, of course, in our interest is the fisheries and aquaculture sector. See, what does it go to small scale operations or large scale, and if so, why is that the case? One example from Seychelles, where I know a little bit more about the detailed places where funding ends up, is that none of the small scale fishers have been able to apply for blue finance, because the requirements are just quite ridiculous, really. They need to fill out so many forms. They need to apply in ways that are not aligned with their realities, the realities in which they operate. So it doesn't end up at small scale operators at all. It ends up at those who are already quite well versed in the financial world and who know how to access sort of the bigger funding. So I think there's definitely more we need to dive in more and keep being that sort of critical lens through which we view these investments.
Thank you. Rhino? All right. Glad to see you're on top of it. Yes.
Hear me? There you go.
Yes, can hear you well.
Well, that was fun. Thanks everyone. I really enjoyed all these presentations. Really enjoyed them. And I'm actually have a question for Ben. And Ben, you spoke in the beginning about your role as a social scientist, learning also this diffusion of technology that you've been doing. And I was wondering if you could help with where we are at now in kind of distributing the technology on this polyculture. If we look inwards to ourselves, what can we learn in terms of diffusion of technologies for this polyculture systems, and what can we do better?
I mean, I guess the polyculture is a very widely diffused system. It's carp polyculture is the basic standard system of aquaculture in Asia. So it's already diffused itself. It doesn't need a lot more diffusion. But the addition of these kind of novel species is the kind of innovation. And so I think it's really notable in places where there has been projects working. There's been a lot of nutrition messaging, sort of raising awareness about the additional value that these small species of fish have. It's now very widely recognized among people in those areas that certain species of fish are particularly nutritious, and they're now ascribed more value than they were in the past. So I think that's actually been quite successful. Actually, much to my surprise, I was a little bit skeptical about this, but having been to the field and actually started asking these questions over the duration of this project and having other people asking these questions, that message is coming through quite strongly, that that kind of messaging has been successful. In terms of the diffusion of the small indigenous fish bit of the technology, as I said in the presentation, that having the ability to mass produce the seed is absolutely fundamental. And if that technology exists, the knowledge to do that exists, and if there's demand from farmers for the seed, then looking at the way the hatchery sector from every other species is developed, then everything will kind of fall into place. If there's demand for the seed, then and the technology exists, hatcheries will begin to produce it. So I really hope that this is the catalyst for that process to really take off. And sort of the next phase of the program is to now begin training as many other hatcheries as possible, so that and really getting this information out in the public domain so that it becomes sort of common knowledge, just in the way that how to spawn a rohu is common knowledge. So yeah, hopefully it will all flow from there.
And I think there'll be probably a really interesting set of questions emerging in terms of how that will change markets, which may well not go in directions that one might expect. And so baselines and other things start to become very important there in terms of looking at how that technology may change things beyond where I think thoughts might be currently. Rainer, I thought you were going to ask something else there or make another comment.
No, I have to, but maybe I'll give me a few minutes while others ask questions.
Okay. Anyone else in the audience here got questions? If not, I might ask Eddie if you have any questions.
Yeah.
this working? Yeah.
It is. Yeah.
I've actually got a question for each of our 4 excellent speakers. Shall I try asking each one
I
at
think
a
that's
time?
fine. Yes.
Okay. I'll start with Ben as he's sitting next to me. And Ben, how do you see this small indigenous nutrient-dense fish aquaculture evolving? One potential pathway is, once you've figured out how to culture mola, everybody wants to culture mola, and so mola spreads around the world rather like tilapia or carp. The other one is that each country develops its own small indigenous fish species, but which of those do you think is more likely?
A good question. So I think the demand for some of these small indigenous fishes may be regionally specific. So these are things that people grew up eating, they're familiar with, they have some kind of familiar, sort of cultural associations. And so I think it's unlikely that we'll have mola transplanted to Africa, for instance, in quite the same way that tilapia has been. But I think in places where it's already part of the diet, if this takes off in the way that we think it might, then it will sort of spread through those regions. So you can see the project is being implemented in India, but there's huge potential for it to move to Bangladesh, for instance. And so with the potential to develop other species, it's like there's a slightly different species assemblage in Cambodia, for instance. So if capture fisheries in Cambodia, inland capture fisheries kind of decline to an extent where those become a lot scarcer than they were in the past, then possibly over time we will see some of those other species sort of being sort of artificially reproduced there.
I guess a quick follow-up is that likely to slow the growth of this compared to, say, the very rapid diffusion of tilapia culture that we've seen globally? Is this the fact that you have to develop hatchery system for each species newly? Is that going to likely cost more and be slower as a result?
Potentially. I mean, each time you start to work on a new species, it requires sort of additional sort of experimentation, additional investment. But what we've seen here is actually with the right team, with the right setup, with a fairly modest amount of investment, you can get results quite quickly. And I think there's actually a lot of potential for doing more of that kind of basic applied research in various different places with various different species, and that's actually something that could be more of a focal area in future.
Thanks. I guess I'll ask Rumana next. Rumana, at the start of your talk, you mentioned you did a literature search and found nothing written on climate advisory services for aquaculture. It made me wonder, was this because such services did not exist, or was it that the aquaculture research community had simply not written about them?
Yeah, thank you, Eddie, for that question. Yeah, I think that what I found during the literature review is there are large amount of literature on climate information services, but focusing on crop agriculture. So it was focused particularly on crop agriculture system, I would say, not all the food systems like aquaculture or other food systems like livestock. So I didn't found, I have found the literature on climate information services, but in line with crop agriculture, but there was no literature on focusing on aquatic food system or aquaculture and fisheries. So sorry, that was the. I think I responded the question. Sorry, Eddie.
Yeah.
Okay.
I guess that's partly a part response. I asked that because when I've looked at a couple of other issues in fisheries, sometimes people have not written about them, but they exist. So I wondered whether when you went into the field and began to look, were there climate advisory services for aquaculture out there, but simply nobody in the aquaculture research community had written about them yet? Or was it in fact that they did not exist? Because what's in the literature and what exists are two different things, of course, as you know.
Yeah. So what I found in the literature actually that was similar in the field. I didn't find any initiative on climate information services for aquaculture in the field as well. And when I went to Department of Fisheries to discuss with them on that, they approach in a way that they want to have a focal point for climate information services at Department of Fisheries to know from us what we have been doing at this moment. So it's similar. I didn't find any there is no literature, but there is something in the field. I didn't find it. Yeah, it was completely absent in the field as well. Is that okay, Eddie?
Yes, sorry.
Yeah, okay.
Sorry, yes, my microphone was off. I responded to say, yes, that makes you a real pioneer in the field. Okay, so next question for Marlene. Marlene, how well do you think you've captured private investment in relation to public finance, given that information on public finance is often or presumably more likely to be publicly available?
Thanks. Yeah, that's a great question. And that's actually one of the main struggles I have with trying to capture everything, and also already finding a huge lack of transparency in the private sector, which is it's problematic for two reasons. One is that I'm just trying to capture everything that's out there, and it's annoying when things aren't very transparent, and I'm struggling to know when to stop searching. And another reason why I think it's problematic is that precisely because of the reason I mentioned before, there's often a lot of blended finance involved in the private sector involvement, which means that a lot of these investments are de-risked by governments. So the first loss, for example, is absorbed by states or by others, at least not by the private sector itself. So I think that's another reason why a lack of transparency is a problem, because you cannot just sort of have the benefits of having sort of favorable conditions, but not sort of the burden of disclosing more information about what you invest in, what your own returns are, and sort of what the projects eventually lead to. So I think one big issue with the private sector is that a lot of information is not disclosed, because it's also potentially you don't want to make your competitors any wiser than they are. But I think in this situation it complicates the image a lot. So thanks for highlighting that. That's actually a big issue.
Eddie, there's a question up on the screen from Atherton. So if Atherton, if you can ask your question, and then we go back to Eddie, and we're getting very close to the end of our session. So Atherton.
Yeah, thank you so much. I hope I'm clear enough.
Yes, hear you well.
Yes, I think my question is directed to Benjamin. Yeah, I think I was quite very interested in the nutrition-sensitive aquaculture. I think it's something that's very key and important. I think as like in my country, I think is have so much issues to do with nutrition, and looking at the usual species we're actually growing. They take quite a long period for people to harvest and access as nutrition for most rural areas. So looking at small species or small sporadic species that can actually be used in aquaculture, I think is something that is very, very crucial. But my question is really focused much on most small species are quite very sensitive in terms of and just general fragile. They are quite fragile. So do you think it's your technology is something that can easily be adopted by small-scale farmers if such a technology would be tried on to our farmers so they can benefit from this approach? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much for the question. So in terms of sort of handling these small fish in a hatchery, yes, they are definitely more fragile than your larger carps, for instance. So they do need to be handled with care. But we had quite high survival rates actually after using them for breeding. About 95% of the fish survived. So it can be done. And in terms of sort of their suitability for culture, they actually do pretty well in sort of standard pond polyculture systems. They don't have sort of special requirements in terms of sort of water quality, for instance, compared to the other commonly cultured species, at least in Asia. So it's quite species specific. Certainly there are some smaller fish that probably wouldn't do well under cultured conditions, but there are plenty that can do okay.
Thank you. Eddie, you're...
Just to say for Marlene's response, there's probably something interesting around transparency and blue finance that you could conjure up, and I'm sure that some good some good projects in that area that there will be quite a call for. Last question then for Hampus. Hampus, what's in your view distinct about island food systems? Maybe identify the 3 or 4 key things. What differentiates them from any other food system that has a strong aquatic component, such as a coastal food system or a floodplain food system? What is it that's distinct about island food systems that merits a new framework?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's probably the key question. I think it's that there are a number of sort of unique characteristics that will vary depending on which islands you're talking about. But if I was to pick 3 of them, climate variability seems to be a really big determinant in relation to vulnerability. Every year there's a world risk report that is published that looks at exposure to natural hazards and countries' ability to cope with those hazards. And out of memory, 6 out of the top 10 countries in the world, and all top 3 are islands, particularly in the Pacific, because of their high exposure to tropical cyclone, earthquakes, and other weather-related and climatic events. So I think something around their exposure to natural hazards is an important feature to consider, and looking at climate resilient systems for sustainable food production is a feature to consider. I think their histories and the colonial pasts and the introduction of agricultural monoculture and plantation agriculture, and something that we're still seeing today in how ministries of agriculture promote cash crops, which is actually driving this shift away from locally attuned crops that are traditionally resilient in the environments where they are grown, and they are increasingly being replaced by other types of crops that are being introduced and don't really fit in there anymore. So this mindset around actively driving an agricultural transition, which appears to be, with the research we have so far, to the detriment of health outcomes in these islands. So I think something around the history and how the history plays out in practice into future policy for agriculture, I think is a really important feature to consider. And the third one is something, I think I'll just pick one that I think is interesting because I'm comparing it with Solomon Islands and Timor-Leste, our 2 island programs. And it's the integration of our aquaculture in island food systems, which tend to otherwise be dominated by ocean fish, which then comes into features of preference. I have this headline statement in Solomon Islands: why would you eat tilapia when you can eat yellowfin tuna and snapper and other wonderful ocean species of fish? But that's a simplification of a complex challenge, and the integration of aquaculture, which is something that is being invested into these island food systems, I think will be a key feature to consider, and how it relates to ocean-dominated aquatic food systems, and and preferences of individuals. Those are three things that come to mind intuitively. There's a whole suite more of them relating to colonial legacies, relating to indigenous peoples. Yeah, I think maybe that will do for now. What do you think, Eddie? What's your view? Give me one, please.
Yeah, yeah. I think those are definitely among the right ones. I think one other key one that I might add is again related to the histories that you mentioned. There's often a very strong trade relationship with a small number of trading partners, and that's often a former colonial power or a sort of key donor or development partner, and that shapes, I think, the food system in ways that there are significant sort of contingent and structural relationships there that are difficult to break down, and the only real challenge to them, I think, comes from, for example, island people, these movements, social movements to re-indigenize food systems or decolonize them. And so, yeah, I think there's that trade history, trade relationships is another key feature of many small island food systems.
Thank you. Our time is up, ladies and gentlemen. So thank you to all our four speakers who've given excellent presentations. And thank you also to the audience here and online all of you pretty much have stayed for the full session, and it's been a very nice discussion and question answer session. So we're closing now. Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you to our speakers.